Welcome, everyone. This is the second presentation in our Open Data Day to 2021. We have the pleasure to have Danielle Brooks from the Office of Equity and Human Rights. The presentation is titled How to Include Demographic Data in Your Data Collection Strategy. This presentation will show you the demographic data standard for collecting equity data in CD information and how the CD needs to collect information from the communities and everything that we do. Danielle Brooks, she is the Civil Rights Title VI and Equity Manager at the Office of Equity and Human Rights. She has been working on developing these demographic standards for the CD for a while now, and is now pretty much ready to use. So with that, Danielle.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Hector. Happy Friday to everyone. So again, I'm going to talk today about some recommended standards as well as good practices and steps to follow when collecting demographic data. And I really want to start out, obviously, with why this is important. It's widely recognized that racial and social inequities continue to have a deep, pervasive, and persistent, or continue to be deep, pervasive, and persistent across all indicators of success. Governments at all levels have played a role in creating and maintaining racial and social inequity. Given this and our ability to implement and drive change at multiple levels and across multiple sectors, we have a responsibility and play a significant role in eliminating these disparities in city vision, goals, plans, policies, values, and through external obligations. The city strongly is committed to becoming an equitable government and advancing towards an equitable and just Portland. And one of the key strategies to advancing equity is to be data-driven. This means that we really need disaggregated data around these community demographics. As you can see from the example on this slide, you'll see that this is a great slide that was provided by the Portland Housing Bureau that looks at rental affordability in Portland. These lighter kind of areas on these maps indicate areas that are considered affordable for the average household to rent. So you notice that in the average map at the kind of upper corner of the screen, that Portland on average looks like a lot of these areas are affordable. But once you start breaking it down by community, you can see that communities are experiencing vast differences and that there are disparities across these communities. If you look at the average Black household cannot afford any neighborhood, or no neighborhood in Portland is considered affordable for rent for the average Black household in Portland. So these are really important things that we need to know. Purposeful data collection and use can really help us. It can, again, help us identify and better understand disparities, unearth trends, understand conditions, root causes, contributing factors, impacts or potential impacts, identify long-term and urgent community needs and priorities, assets, improve our services and practices, better design policy or develop innovative interventions, target resources and services, and just generally develop baselines, set goals, and measure progress, ultimately to ensure that we meet the needs and well-being of community. So again, this is really important. Disaggregated data serves a purpose. And not only is data critical to equity and good governance, but it's also equally important to center equity in data practice. Without deliberate efforts, data at any stage can be used to reproduce and exacerbate existing harm. So in the collection stage, including demographics is considered a best practice, but it does have to be done thoughtfully and carefully. Collecting demographic information is most effective and meaningful when equity is embedded at all stages. So let's see, establishing again, that it's important to use, or that we use demographic data from secondary sources. And obviously that's important for us to include demographics in our own data collection efforts. It's interesting because for a while we were seeing a lot of surveys that went out from the city that didn't even ask any demographic questions, or they just asked one, or they were using different questions and different answer categories, both within Bureau collection efforts or across the city. Meanwhile, we've been advising bureaus about their obligations to use and collect information, especially related to BIPOC communities and people with disabilities, to inform decisions and monitor and impacts and services. So while we're giving out this advice, we were then asked, of course, to provide a format. simultaneously, while all of this is happening, there were all these changes that were being proposed at the federal level that didn't end up happening, but a lot of those changes were adopted by other agencies, and they were really rooted in coming out of community recommendations and recommendations from practitioners. So with the intention of improving the process, we at OEHR moved forward with a step to develop a set of recommended standards to facilitate appropriate collection of data or of demographics in a robust and consistent manner to ensure the implementation of equity strategies and adhere to those federal obligations, build in guidance for steps that were highly related and needed considerations in alignment with privacy principles and quality data stewardship. And that we also provided a set of those demographic standards or question and answer categories that reflected community-centered best practices aligned with other demographic standards and that were usable by city bureaus. Given the scope and critical nature of the categories, we focused on race and ethnicity, language, disability, and tribal affiliation, and kind of created a set of standards for that. We wanted inclusion of demographics, again, to be the standard of public data collection, but we recognize that it might not always be appropriate. So really the first step is to determine whether you should or should not collect demographic data in individual efforts. And again, one of these pieces is really highly related to the privacy policy and privacy principles with the city. The city's responsible for honoring pledges of confidentiality and protecting the privacy of the public we serve while collecting demographic data. Again, this is incorporated with all elements of the data lifecycle and data infrastructure. Individually identifiable information about survey respondents, especially underrepresented and marginalized communities, has to be protected to ensure data security and respondent privacy. So all city bureaus have to adhere to the requirements of the privacy principles to guide actions. And we wanted those actions to be considered first when you're trying to decide whether to collect information. So it's important to identify and assess the risks and potential impacts in advance to either take appropriate steps, risk reduction steps or mitigation steps, caveats and safeguards. So data is more secure and confidential when those personal identifiers are anonymized, processed for data access are rigorous and transparent, and errors and breach in protocol carry consequences. So you can either design it so that those are in place, again, to really protect privacy, or not collect data at all, especially even with those other mitigation efforts. If collection compromises confidentiality, data stewardship and privacy standards, is considered statistically unreliable, inappropriate, or significantly linked and related to potential abuse or misuse, and the risk of the abuse significantly outweighs data use and need, it's really better to actually not collect demographic information. And we recognize the need for that. So when you are collecting, however, race and ethnicity and other demographic data, we have provided standards and recommended consistent standards and categories. So we again ask that people are using consistent standards or these consistent standards. It's important to be able to compare across the Bureau or across cities. So it is really crucial that we keep this consistency. We have built into our standards both minimum and comprehensive and optional categories. We know that there's all these different considerations on whether to use minimum or comprehensive demographic questions. And we know that there's other issues that may be at play, whether it's privacy standards and the sample size of the population. So again, those privacy considerations need to be applied. You also might not have the space to ask really robust demographic questions, and it might be a little odd when your demographic questions far exceed your other survey questions. So we did want to provide both minimum and comprehensive standards for flexibility. Additionally, different bureaus might also have reporting requirements from external agencies, and we want to recognize that. These categories do align with federal reporting standards, but there are some differences. So it's important to look at those reporting requirements, and if there really can't be alignment and aggregation, it's important to go with those other reporting requirements from external agencies. So we really wanted to build, again, all of this into our standard practice. The other piece that's important is that if you collect one of these. So if you're just planning to collect race and ethnicity data or demographics, or if that was what you originally planned, it's important that you collect all. So we really, again, wanted to create that consistency that when you're collecting one piece of that really sensitive demographic information, that you collect all of it. We need all of this information to help move our work forward. When you do collect demographic data, identification is a core value and core principle of this work. You should never make assumptions and decide on somebody's demographics for them. So it's really important that people are allowed to fill this out, that you allow multiple responses where possible. So, and usually this is just generally a best practice. People are complex, their identities are complex, and we should be able to, folks should be able to identify multiple answers underneath a particular question if that's, what's representative of them and their identity. All of the demographic information should be voluntary. It should never be forced or compelled. And just on a general formatting, it's important to keep demographic questions at the end of your survey or questionnaire, or whatever your collection effort is. There's also some considerations that need to be in place and some information that need to be shared with the public when you're collecting demographic information. General best practice include, that you have an equity and kind of purpose statement about why you're collecting this data and how it's going to be used. A non-discrimination statement that you're not going to use the data to discriminate against a person, that the information is voluntary, whether the collection effort is confidential or anonymous, and where they might be able to go to get additional information. It's also really, there's some other opportunities to be able to allow for voluntary and disclosure clauses, notifying them or allowing a person to basically voluntarily agree to provide their information and that they understand how it's going to be used. And a lot of this also relates to Oregon public records laws. It's important to talk with the city attorneys about this. The meaningful access statement, while it is important to include when you're collecting demographic information, it's also important to include regardless. So whether you decide to collect demographics, you need to include a meaningful access statement, and templates are available on our Office of Equity webpage. This is basically a statement that informs the public of their right to request accommodations, whether for language access purposes, because they're a person with a disability who needs accessible access and accessible format. People need to know that they have that right and where to go to make that request. So that's actually something that needs to be on all surveys, questionnaires, all data collected from the public or engagement with the public. So to the actual standards themselves. Again, we really looked across the board when we were developing these to make sure that they were consistent with community-centered best practices that were also adopted by other agencies. So these highly align to what we see in different departments of health and social services, other counties and cities across the country, and that have been recommended by other organizations, the Policy Link and other kind of equity-centered or community-centered organizations. We did want to make sure that they align again with different federal standards, and that we provided some flexibility by providing both minimum kind of expanded options as well as optional questions. So I don't need to spend a ton of time on this. You'll have access to this PowerPoint, but I do just want to identify a few things and basically give you an example. So this is the race and ethnicity category. What's important here is to note that race and ethnicity is combined. Again, this is incredibly common, and one of the pieces that was recommended to the Census Bureau for the 2020 census. And it's really often seen with the Department of Health and Human Services and is their kind of standard practice. This is, again, the minimum category and minimum questions. And please note the addition of Middle Eastern and North African categories or answer options. So this is what it looks like with the comprehensive category. Again, the comprehensive pieces either aggregate back up to the minimum, or usually, as you'll see with others, it's maybe just a set of additional questions. So with this, you can see that the answer categories are much more expansive, allowing for further detail and kind of really disaggregation. This really does help us identify some patterns and disparities that may exist in between groups. So when you can collect this robust information, it's important that you do. So let's see, with language categories, pretty straightforward. Language spoken or signed at home. And then with the comprehensive, you see that same question, but with a set of additional questions and kind of a really recommended optional question. So the disabilities category, again, this is a minimum standard. A couple of important things to note. This is actually a little bit different than the federal standards. We kind of took into consideration what we thought would be best used information for the city, and a group of folks who really work in disability justice, in accessible practices for government, and folks with lived experience developed this kind of set of different questions and answers that really were intended for better use and better representation for people with disabilities community. So it's really important that if you do have federal standards that you have to adhere to, that you really compare and look at the difference. And also this is a really important, it's really important that your data security measures are in place and that privacy is really taken into consideration with this type of question. So this is the comprehensive version. Again, much more expansive, much more descriptive. These actually do align a little bit better with the federal standards because they have this additional kind of description that does align with some detail in the federal standards. But again, it is lengthy, and security, it's really important again to make sure that all of your practices adhere. Finally, we have the Alaska or American Indian Alaska Native Tribal Affiliation category. This was recommended to us by our Tribal Relations Director, Laura John, and the language, she helped craft the language. It is, again, pretty important that you keep and don't dilute this language. This question relates to sovereignty and is associated with rights and benefits, not race and ethnicity. So another point or important point of formatting is to keep this category separate from the race and ethnicity category. So usually have a couple of questions in between them. But it is an important question to ask, again, because it does relate to sovereignty and rights and benefits. So that's kind of our standards. We do recognize, of course, that there's other demographic questions and that those demographic questions and answers do need to be standardized across the city. It was just a bit outside of our scope, and these require broader discussions. It does not mean that these questions shouldn't be asked or this demographic data shouldn't be collected. And of course, this is always part of an ongoing effort. So there's definitely still issues and questions and considerations that need to be addressed and vetted. And we definitely want to make sure that we're aligning and weighing out our need for confidentiality and privacy with our need for data, that we're looking at what we can do in analysis and reporting, and that we're using the equitable practices within those kind of different steps. We need to, really still figure out and see what's going to happen with the addition of the MENA category and new disability categories, multiracial identities, and especially in analysis and reporting. So there's all these different things that's part of a much larger and ongoing process. And so, we did develop these recommendations, obviously, to address a need and improve government process. And this is one very small, but still important piece to better enable us to eliminate disparities and advance equity and justice. And I know that was fast and I was talking quickly. I just wanted to try and get through everything. So I think with that, we are ready for questions.
Thank you, Danielle, for this presentation. For those who are watching this recording, please send your questions through our Smart City webpage at smartcitypdx.com through the contact page.